Hey, Professor Wiseguy here in the cemetery with a closer look at using GPS for good research. Now, if you haven't already watched it, then check out part 1 of this video right here. It covers an overview of the process and the first 2 steps. In part 2, we're going to consider the remaining 3 steps in the GPS. That's the Genealogical Proof Standard. The next of the 5 elements, number 3, is up now. Number 3 says that good research, quote, tests through processes of analysis and correlation of all the sources, information items, and evidence. I think that's kind of wonky grammar, but hopefully you get the idea. Now, there's a tradition in one branch of our family. Since I first heard about it, I've learned that this tradition is absurdly widespread. What, you ask, is this tradition? It claims that we are descended from Pocahontas. According to this theory, espoused by a distant relative and put in a book, so it has to be true, right? If you go 11 generations back from me, you'll reach a genuine Disney princess, or at least the historical character on whom the Disney character was very loosely based. Now here's where it gets kind of complicated. All right, stick with me. Between Grandma Pocahontas and me, we have 10 separate people. I can go back across the first 4 of those and have great confidence that I have all the connections made, all the right people plugged in. I can also work my way down from Pocahontas. You see, since she married into some really prominent early Virginia families, there have been plenty of people with lots of time on their hands who traced out all of her descendants. There are actual books on this topic, and as I trace down from Pocahontas, I can be very sure that the oldest 6 people out of these 10 are correctly identified. But here's the problem. I can't exactly match up number 4 and number 5. Was 5 a guy named Thomas Bowling who was born into a wealthy Virginia family in 1807? Was he really the father of my number 4, Sarah Bowling, who was born in 1837 in Tennessee? There's no record of that Thomas ever having a daughter named Sarah, or that he ever spent any time in Tennessee. And also that family tradition says that Sarah was raised by her grandfather, William Buck Bowling. But why? Thomas lived until 1889, some 30 years after Sarah was married and having a family. It just doesn't add up. Do you see the problems I struggle with? But seriously, whenever we do research, it is absolutely vital that we are more than just collectors of information. You can gather information all day long. That doesn't make you a researcher. To be a researcher, you have to apply some intelligence to your findings. Specifically, the GPS says you should use analysis and correlation of your sources, all your sources. So what does that mean that you need to do? Well, analysis requires that you look hard at every source. All sources are not created equal. Some are more or less biased, more or less expert, more or less dependable. If you treat them all the same, then you're not doing any analysis. Instead, you have to give a great deal of scrutiny to each source. You have to make sure that you know exactly what it says and what it doesn't say. You need to question its credibility, its citations, and its conclusions. Then you need to make sure that you do proper correlation. That means that you take those individual carefully analyzed sources and you compare them to one another. Do they contradict one another? If so, we have a whole GPS element for that. Do they speak to one another? Sometimes you learn one fact from source A and another fact from source B, but by comparing those facts, you can learn a handful or even an armful of other facts. Let's take an example. Let's say you're writing a paper about childhood obesity. One source tells you that the number of overweight and obese children in the world has increased 60% over the last 20 years. Your first step will be to analyze that. You might ask questions about how they define overweight and obese, or in what countries these obese children live. Then you might remember that another source told you that the first episode of The Simpsons aired on December 17th, 1989. And right there, you reach your eureka moment. There's been a 60% increase in overweight and obese children since The Simpsons has been on the air. Coincidence? Okay, it almost certainly was. That would be an example of correlation run amok. Hopefully, you'll be able to do a more careful and useful correlation when the time comes. Am I descended from Pocahontas? There's still that family tradition from way back. Through analysis and correlation, I've satisfied myself that the proposed path back to Pocahontas is wrong. But there might be another one. If I ever make the case, then I'll have to do GPS element number 3. First, I'll have to analyze every source I use to make sure that it is accurately and correctly pulling the information. And second, I'll need to correlate the sources to draw reasonable conclusions where absolutely direct evidence doesn't exist. When the cemetery workers here dig a grave, they carefully measure from established corner markers. Those are little concrete posts that were placed there using precise surveying years ago. What if they carelessly placed one grave in a row of 50 and they put it 1 foot to the left or the right of where it's supposed to be? That one oversight would mess up all the others. That's what happens when we don't analyze our source materials. Think it through. Let's move on to the 4th of the 5 elements of the Genealogical Proof Standard, or GPS, to see how it applies to the sort of research writing you might do. Number 4 calls for resolution of conflicts among evidence items. Now, I am the youngest child of a youngest child. What does that mean? It means that my grandfather, Thomas Lewis Browning, was 83 when I was born. In fact, my grandfather died young and had been gone 15 years when I made my first appearance. Still, it shouldn't be all that hard to figure out when your grandfather was born, right? It's not like I came from a family scattered by war or anything. So let's go back to the sources. First, my grandfather's headstone says that he was born November 24th, 1881. Now, shouldn't that settle the matter? Actually, that's good enough proof for a lot of people. But let's make sure. We're going to look at the man's death certificate and be shocked to see that it puts his birth on November 24th, 1881. Okay, now isn't the matter settled? We have 2 solid pieces of evidence that both agree. So he was born in 1881, but not so fast. We're going to do reasonably exhaustive research and we're going to analyze and correlate the findings. So let's think for a second. That death certificate, obviously he didn't fill it out himself, right? Who did? Well, it was probably his wife. In fact, it says it was. And who most likely ordered the headstone? His wife again, right? So do we actually have 2 separate sources? No, his wife provided both of them at about the same time. So clearly she thought he was born in 1881. Now let's go to the U.S. Census in 1940. It says that he was 58. Assuming that the census was taken before his birthday in November, that number fits for 1881. In 1930, he's listed at 48, which is what we would expect. But then in 1920, we find him listed at 40. So how could that be? If it said 39, then we could imagine that they took the census late in that year after his birthday, but 40 doesn't work for 1881 at all. I guess it must just be a mistake, right? In 1910, he's 29, which could work but shouldn't. They're supposed to use his age on June 1st of that year, but maybe the census taker messed up. On the 1900 census, while Thomas was still in his parents' home, he's 20. But on that census, they didn't just list ages, but year of birth, and they listed him as born in 1879. Did his parents not know how old he was? There's no 1890 census, as most of it burned up years ago, which brings us to the 1880 census. If Thomas wasn't born until 1881, it would be pretty tough for him to appear on the 1880 census. Yet there he is, Thomas, 9/12 of a year old, born September 1879. Added to that, we have a birth record from Fayette County, Illinois, that places his birth date at September 27th, 1879. And we find that apparently none of the facts on Thomas's gravestone goes uncontested. So how do we account for my grandfather's conflicted birth date information? Clearly the family didn't know that he would be born a year earlier than he was and include him on the census. So what's the explanation? Here's a possibility. The parents had a son whom they named Thomas. In September of 1879, he was born, but then he died after the 1880 census. And they then named their next son, born in November of 1881, with the same name. He's the replacement Thomas. That's possible, but it doesn't account for the 1900 census, and there's no 1881 birth record in Fayette County. Now, when I shared this puzzle with my father, he thought a minute and then shared a story. It seems that when his father first met his mother around 1900, he shared his correct age, but then he claimed to be 2 years younger. His explanation was that he had lied at first to seem older and more mature. In fact, he apparently lied through most of his life to seem younger and closer to her age. So what does this long tale tell us? It emphasizes the need to look closely at sources and then to do our best to resolve the conflicts that arise between them. Sometimes we can't resolve the conflicts, but instead just have to admit to the difficulties that we've discovered. Resolution of conflicts does a couple of things for a good research writer. First, it gives more substantial and dependable information to the reader. And then second, it demonstrates the care and attention to detail that the writer has exercised. Here at Mount Washington Cemetery, the famous frontiersman Jim Bridger is buried. Or maybe he's not. The guy who used to run this place said that he had documents proving that Bridger was buried here. Then he explained that, in fact, Jim Bridger wasn't here. What's that supposed to mean? I never learned. Multiple sources can be annoyingly contradictory, but we have no real choice but to deal with them. Do your best to resolve the contradictions. We've done the first 4 GPS steps. Now it's time to wrap things up with the last of the 5 elements in the Genealogical Proof Standard. Number 5 demands a soundly reasoned, coherently written conclusion. Now, as a student, you might think that this element of the GPS is really the only one that matters. It is certainly the one that if you skip it, you're going to torpedo your GPA. But I'd suggest that if you skip any of steps 1 through 4, then you'll have a very hard time doing number 5, or at least doing it very well. Sure, you could write a conclusion, but it's highly unlikely that it'll be soundly reasoned or coherent. You know, the essay Joan Didion once said, "I don't know what I think until I write it down." Well, I understand that. Sometimes we find ourselves with a bunch of facts. They seem to add up to say something, but until we can put them together in a structured manner, we really just have beginnings. Maybe at some point in the past, you've had a school assignment where you created a family tree. It tells who your parents and your grandparents and so on are, and maybe when they were born or where or when they died or other information. But is that the real story? In the other video, I mentioned my ancestor, Philip Snyder. Now, connecting from Philip to me is pretty simple and straightforward. I have the documents to clearly blaze the trail. But hooking up Philip with his parents and grandparents was a little bit challenging. I could just name him, his parents and his grandparents, while tossing a handful of sources to you, even citing them properly, but doing that won't really demonstrate how I concluded that Philip's parents were George Snyder and Anna Marie Hedrick, and that his grandparents were Adam Hedrick and Maria Hagee. You could see the church records from their church in the original German and read Adam's will, but I would need to walk you through the details to show that with very little doubt, these 3 generations are connected. You see, simple information on a family tree or another sort of form won't get the job done. For centuries, writing has been the way that people have expressed and shared their brilliant conclusions. There was a time when writing was largely published by way of public speeches, but it was still writing. Today, there's probably more writing shared by way of video than print, but it is still writing. In making these videos, I could have just talked off the top of my head. You thought I was, right? But to be sure that I had things worked out and expressed in the best way I could manage, I write and follow scripts. After all, how could I know what I think until I write it down? Writing it down will expose any flaws that still linger in your work. If you've been careless with the facts or with the logic, then you got a better chance of seeing that and then fixing it when the ideas are on paper or on your computer screen. The writing down of your research findings is almost like a victory lap. If you've done all of the other hard work that goes into a really worthwhile research project, you've earned the right to share it and share it with others, to brag on yourself a little, to show off your work and how smart you are. Whether you are working in a library research field like literature or history, a social science like anthropology or sociology, or a lab-based field such as chemistry or physics, the common denominator has always been writing. Maybe you can discover a way to convey complicated economic concepts or legal theories through music or painting, but until then, you have to write. You probably don't care why genealogists write, but you should care why well-educated people in a variety of fields write. The ability to articulate your conclusions, your ideas, through writing, whatever form that writing takes, will have a profound impact on your future success. So let's wrap this thing up and make sure that your writing has these important qualities. One, it should be soundly reasoned or logical, free from excessive bias or sloppy thinking. Two, it should be coherently written so that whatever audience is intended can understand what you have to say. Just over there, you'll find the grave of James A. Reed, a famous lawyer, a mayor of Kansas City, and a U.S. Senator. There's a bit of information about him on the monument, but it doesn't begin to tell the whole story. Until somebody writes a biography of Senator Reed, I think they have actually, but then his story is just a bunch of facts. The same goes with the result of your research. Write it down. So there we have it. The 5 steps of the Genealogical Proof Standard are great for researching your ancestors, but they'll apply to and should be used in every research situation. Just so you remember, here they are one last time. Exhaustive research, proper citations, testing of all sources, resolving conflicts between sources, and a well-reasoned, coherent written report. That's all I've got. That was long, but that's okay. Use these things, you'll do better research writing. Now, if you've enjoyed this, you know all the stuff to do, right? Like it, subscribe, ring the bell, but for now, get out of here.